Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore. As a kind of follow-up to our previous coverage of the Cherry Hill community of Baltimore, specifically the report conducted by our colleague Jessel Noor about Cherry Hill's ability to prevent crime and violence better than the police, we sit now with Dr. Ray Winbush, director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University, also here in Baltimore, to discuss a new report he and his colleagues have recently presented to the community titled A Comprehensive Demographic Profile of the Cherry Hill Community in Baltimore City. The report gives both the history of that section of the city, assesses the material conditions of the residents, and offers programmatic steps going forward designed to address persistent obstacles to advance. Welcome, Dr. Winbush, back to the Real News.
How you doing, Jerry?
As good as could be expected, my man. So let's start with, if we can, with where you conclude and saying in your report that this is even a departure from what you actually normally do in terms of offering recommendations, where you do recommend that the 2008 Cherry Hill Community Master Plan that you say was shelved be reinstituted and applied to the people of Cherry Hill, the community of Cherry Hill. So if you would tell us what that plan calls for and why you recommend that it be followed up on.
Well, you know, a lot of times when you do these reports, you know, it's already been done. And recommendations that have not been implemented, you know, just are in the past. Well, we decided to do something very different. We decided to say, look, we've got this excellent report that was done under the Sheila Dixon administration that outlined over 100 points with accountability, who was supposed to be tasked to do it, and they gave them 5 years to put it in place. So we use that as our conclusion rather than say, let's put another 100 points out for the community. And in doing that, we feel that we did a service because we reignited interest in what the Dixon administration had already recommended for Cherry Hill, which was excellent stuff. I mean, I think, you know, just from a cultural point of view, one of the biggest issues that they recommended that should follow is the cultural preservation of Cherry Hill historically. That, and the idea of gentrification was something that was going to be viewed as a no-no rather than something that should be welcome. Cultural preservation of African-American communities around the country, very important, and a lot of times developers neglect that.
So we started at the end, so to speak, but let's go back a little bit, because as we were talking a little bit before, when people hit in this general area here, Cherry Hill, even for those of us who grew up out in the county, back in the day, Cherry Hill brings a certain connotation. Bang, bang. That's right. You know, that's been associated with many black communities in this country and really around the world, actually. So give us, your report does a great job of outlining in the history of Cherry Hill. Tell us that history, if you would, and what actually is the community all about.
Well, you know, that whole area, you know, down by the Patapsco River was always isolated from the rest of Baltimore City. So if you talk about the ancient history, it goes back over 200 years when that, you kind of, when you lived in that area, white settlers, of course, that it was kind of viewed as being kind of outside of the, you know, the city. In
the southern
kind of southwest of the city, you know, Baltimore City.
Like a peninsula.
It is. It is a peninsula, actually. So in the 1930s and 1940s, you know, World War II was kind of gearing up. The big issue was all of the black folk from the Great Migration were moving to Baltimore. Baltimore was one of the most heavily populated, you know, African American cities in this country. But after World War II, they said we needed to have a place for the black veterans who didn't want to go back south to Mississippi. In fact, many of their relatives during the war had moved up there.
Which, by the way, is part of that Great Migration, for those who may not know. It's African people moving from the south to the north to escape
exactly,
all kinds of
racism and all this stuff.
Right.
But see, they encounter, you know, I always say that, you know, moving to Maryland was like moving from down south to up south. And specifically, the residents of white Baltimore didn't want that integration. They had seen enough black folk between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. I mean, I always tell people that Washington was becoming Chocolate City at that time, maybe whatever the early stages of chocolate would be. And they said, well, where can we put these residents? They said, let's put them in Cherry Hill. Cherry Hill at that time was polluted. The city incinerator was down there. The water was nasty, all types of stuff. But white folks could put them over there. The NAACP actually protested it. Afro did too, editorialized against it. But that's where Cherry Hill became Cherry Hill, if you want to mark it right at about the cusp of World War II.
So we're talking about Cherry Hill becoming as you talk about, the first African-American planned suburb, or what was at one point called the model Negro village.
It was literally called the model Negro village, and Baltimore bragged about it nationally. They said, we've got a suburb, and it's kind of an exaggeration, because when we think about suburbs, we think about mowed lawns, picket white fence, and all white picket fence and all that. It was an area where a lot of middle-class black folk moved because they didn't experience some of the racism that was going on in Baltimore City. So it was a suburb in a very loose definition of the term, but it was planned. A lot of opposition, but it's almost like the residents eventually said, look, we want to be here, we'll make the best of it. And it's just almost like the way HBCUs were planned to fail. Right. Cherry Hill was planned to fail, the Cherry Hill community, but it succeeded, very much so. And
developed a sense of community that still exists to this day.
Still to this day.
That defies the popular image of Cherry Hill as this wasteland of violence. In fact, the report that we were talking about from Jessel Noor was talking about how that community had in its own way reduced the violence to almost non-existent, relatively speaking, without police help, without the state officially drawing, I'm assuming at least, on this history of a sense of community.
Well, yeah, and you know what it is, Jared, that it seems that historically, neighborhoods that were all black, that were self-contained, had their own sense of community, were viewed as dangerous. On a personal note, I was raised on Huff Avenue in east side of Cleveland, and when I grew up, when you said you came from Huff, the old saying, Huff is rough, Harlem, south side of Chicago, Beale Street in Memphis.
Southeast DC.
Southeast DC and Cherry Hill. In fact, if you look at the history, there was violence in these communities, but it wouldn't be like they were more so than other parts of the country or anything else like that. So now we find that Cherry Hill most recently has gone 400 days, over 400 days, without a homicide. Baltimore City can't say that. And some communities in the nation.
In fact, this is happening in the midst of Baltimore City's, what some are saying is the most violence in many decades.
In decades. Yeah. So the answer, we want to know why. Why is that? There is a remarkable, and this sounds very abstract and kind of new agey, but there's a remarkable sense of community in that community. We've made several trips down there doing this research, and people know each other. You walk down, hey man, what's going on? And they not just hello, but call out, how's so-and-so doing? There's another thing, and I know some people might be upset about, there's not that many churches down there. and the number of churches that are there are very involved with the community. So you have this sense that we were just surprised at all the meetings we called, especially because Morgan State and not Johns Hopkins and other white institutions, people came out, they wanted to talk, they loved their community. They brag about the fact that Montel Williams, Dwayne Wickham are from that area, and other famous people as well. It wasn't, the stereotype, I believe, is one that has been created by white America historically to demonize these communities, to make people feel afraid of them. And in fact, these communities are very good places to live. I would live in Cherry Hill right now. And I'm not just saying that, I would live in it because it's a place that you can feel the sense of safety surrounded by your people, and people belong and they feel that in the community.
Now, in just the few minutes we have left, there were a couple of things I wanted to quickly address with you that are not all perfect about Cherry Hill, but most of it seems to stem not from the people's behavior as often is reported, but from a history of institutional and state-sponsored inequality. So you talk about that in the report that Cherry Hill is a food desert.
That's right.
You talk about the difficulty with transportation. and as you mentioned already, the general resistance to a desire for gentrification, which again goes against the popular tide in terms of what we often hear about these communities. But if I read it correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, you are saying that a lot of these issues have their origins from the impact of segregated housing as it was developed there from the 1940s and 50s. Could you just say a couple of words about that?
No, you're absolutely. We found that almost every problem that Cherry Hill has comes from poor governance, history, not of the community, but I'm talking about coming down from City Hall, institutionalized racism and classism, where people said, we're not going to do certain things for this community. You know, Cherry Hill is over there. Transportation, for example. We had several residents tell us that buses will pass them. They'll be at the bus stop with groceries because they're going to go outside of their community to get groceries oftentimes because it is a food desert by definition. And buses will pass them. And then some bus drivers will open up the door and say, you can get on the bus, but you can't let your groceries get on the bus, which doesn't make sense. What does that do? Residents have to catch cabs paying more money just to get food. So all of that has nothing to do with the residents of Cherry Hill. Those are policies, both deliberate and, tacit, saying, well, that's Cherry Hill, let it go. The buses are not as new in Cherry Hill as in other parts of the city. And all of those type of things go to make the community under stress. Mindy Fully Love in her book Root Shock talks about, communities that are under shock. And Cherry Hill has always been under assault from the powers that be.
Well, Ray Winbush, I want to thank you very much for talking with us about this report, and we want to let people know they can get it at the Institute for Urban Research website at Morgan State University's
Absolutely.
website to see the whole report. And we're going to do a quick transition and have a part 2 of this conversation coming up to talk, because I want to talk with you about how or why maybe the same issues that are faced by people in Cherry Hill have been faced not only historically, but today in other parts of the country, but have been responded to very differently, including what's happening there in Ferguson. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. We're going to have a part 2 with Professor Winbush here in just a second, here at The Real News. For all involved, again, I'm Jared Ball, here in Baltimore, and as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. We'll be back in a minute.